So one thing I definitely wanted to get from you was a bit more of an insight into the history of Iran, specifically Persia and the name Persia. I've heard here in the West after meeting uh, Iranians or Persians, them refer to themselves as Persian, and the history predates Iran, and maybe you can touch on that a little bit.
Sure. Well, Persian is the English word in our current vernacular, uh, but Iranians never really referred to their land as Persia. Goes back in ancient times to the Greek word for Iran, and it referred to the capital district of Pars. And much of Persian history, I'm using the word Persian because I'm speaking English right now, but much of Persian history was written by the Greeks, like Herodotus and Heraclitus, who had great reverence for Persian culture and for leaders like Cyrus the Great, who was the founder and leader of the ancient Achaemenid dynasty. So Pars was the capital district of what was referred to as really Iran Shah, which means dominion of the Aryans. And so these Persian empires, of which there were at least three successive Persian empires, spanned the known globe. I mean, these were enormous empires that encompassed much of the modern Middle East, India, Afghanistan, and crucially the Caucasus as well. They mostly fought their wars with the Romans and with the Greeks. And, it was not only ethnically Persian people that were a part of this dominion. You had other ethnic groups that identified as Iranian as well. So today, I mean, it's kind of a mishmash. It's a bit confusing, the distinction between Iranian and Persian. But it goes back in particular to the Greek word for the capital district of the Iranian Empire. Today, I think it more approximates something like Persian to mean Persian ethnicity and Persian culture, and Iranian to meaning Iranian as a nation, Iranian nationalism, which could encompass Kurds and Arabs and Armenians as well.
So my knowledge was up until recently that Iranian was exclusively an Islamic country and is predominantly in 2018. But I learned from you in our private conversations about Zoroastrianism and some of the older religions that predate Islam in that region. Maybe you could tell me a bit about that as well.
Definitely. First, it's crucial to recognize that Iran as a political and cultural entity existed much longer than Islam has existed. You're talking about 3,000 years of history and culture, really an unbroken chain of celebrating the same rituals, of reading the same texts, and really developing the first monotheistic religion in the form of Zoroastrianism as well. Islam, in the context of this 3,000 years of history, Islam is a relatively late introduction into Iran, introduced largely by force in the 7th century by Arabs emanating out of Saudi Arabia, and I would argue socioculturally changing the country for the worse. I think that the introduction largely by force of Islam into Iran has really been a tragedy for Iran more than anything else. And I think it has taken its most tragic political form over the past 40 years as the result of an Islamic theocratic government taking place in Iran. There have been many flashpoints between this distinct Persian ethos or Persian spirit of a civilization and Islam, because they do not align properly. And when those contradictions take place, you end up seeing conflict take place as well. So, for example, Iranians have been celebrating Nowruz. It's debated, but for some 3,000 years. I mean, the oldest records we have referencing Nowruz are something like 2,000 years old, but it's believed that it's around 3,000 years of celebrating Nowruz. And Nowruz is highly significant and highly symbolic to Persian civilization, or to Iranian civilization. It's celebrated not only in modern-day Iran, it's celebrated in the Caucasus, it's celebrated in India, it's celebrated in Afghanistan, it's celebrated in Iraq. and it celebrates the spring equinox. It's on the first day of spring, and Iranians put out 7 items on a table that all start with the letter S that are highly symbolic of essentially rejuvenation and renewal, which makes sense because when you've emerged from caves and you have this prosperous agricultural society, spring is your most valued time of the year. And so Iranians have been celebrating this for around 3,000 years. This is not an Islamic holiday. This is much older than Islam. And it's a very joyous holiday. You'll notice this about many Iranian holidays, that they tend to be filled with a lot of joy by the celebrants. Whereas most Islamic holidays are defined much more by grief and of sorrow and tend to eschew any celebrations of joy. So when the Islamic Republic emerged in Iran in 1979, at first they tried to deny Iranians essentially their right to celebrate Nowruz. They didn't want overt displays of Iranian identity. There's many instances of this. I'm just giving you one flashpoint, but there's many more we can go through. So at first they tried to deny it, which was not going to happen because you cannot oppress a 3,000-year-old civilization. People pass these traditions on to their children. And after that failed, Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the Islamic Revolution, and the clerical establishment attempted to appropriate Nowruz by claiming that those 7 items placed on a table are really Islamic in nature and that Nowruz is an Islamic holiday. And nobody bought it because it's completely ahistorical. This was a craven political attempt to deny Iranians their heritage and to subsume them within a larger Islamic society that ultimately whose goal was to establish an Islamic caliphate. I mean, it's in the Constitution. This is not, the weird ramblings of some blog writer. It's in the Constitution when Khomeini talks about wanting to export the revolution. So Nowruz is one crucial flashpoint, but there are many others. There are other similar Iranian holidays like Chaharshanbe Suri, Shab-e Yalda. And in fact, Shab-e Yalda is the longest night of the year, and it's a celebration because at that point you've reached the valley, and everything from there is an improvement. The days start getting longer, and Iranians, under Zoroastrianism, really they hold light and darkness to be very significant. They revere. They are referred to as fire worshippers, which isn't actually accurate, but they have a lot of reverence for mehr, or light. So the fact of the calendar changing and the days getting longer is highly significant as well, and has been celebrated by Iranians for thousands of years. Just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I posted this on Facebook. Just before the major uprisings broke out, there were Shab-e Yalda celebrations on the streets of Tehran, and the authorities in Iran arrested some 200 people for doing so. So this has been going on for a long time, this contrast between what I'll keep referring to as a Persian ethos and the Islamic religion that was introduced in the 7th century. I'll go through another example. Well, 2 more could be highly significant here. When Khomeini came to power, and we'll go through all the politics of this as well, but when he came to power, he really explicitly wanted to emphasize the Islamic nature of the people under his dominion rather than their Iranian heritage. And he went so far as to say at one point, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially saying, and this is within the context of his fantastical dreams of an Islamic caliphate taking place, his idea was that the leader of the Islamic Republic one day need not necessarily be an Iranian. He might well be an Egyptian or a Syrian, for example, because they're Muslim as well. So he wanted to kind of be the standard bearer for the Ummah, the community of all Muslims. This in spite of a very significant Sunni-Shia schism. And then finally, I'll just say that one of the most revered characters in Iranian history for his contributions to Persian literature and retaining the Persian linguistic style and Persian language is the epic Iranian poet Ferdowsi, Abul Qasim Ferdowsi. And I have a photo of me at his giant mausoleum in the city of Tus, which is just outside of Mashhad, which is where these protests originated, which we'll talk about as well. And Ferdowsi is credited with, in the wake of the Arab invasion, the Arab invaders were essentially imposing the Arabic language on Iranians. And this is where we can start to get into this mythical Islamic golden age, which was, I'm going to argue, one of the most consequential and insidious forms of cultural appropriation, of real cultural appropriation, not Kim Kardashian wearing dreadlocks or something like that, of actual claiming scientific and artistic progress for another civilization. So that I mean, we do have many Arabic words in modern Persian too, to be sure, and the character set is almost entirely the same. I mean, there are some differences, but it's heavily influenced by it as well. And were it not for Ferdowsi, who wrote the Shahnameh, the epic poem of kings, which is just this enormous book that tells, the whole. It's highly significant in Persian mythology in that it tells the story of ancient Persian kings.
He was kind of the Virgil
or
the Homer of Persian.
Yeah, very much so.
Literature,
yeah, like an Odyssey or an Iliad. Yeah. And what he did was write this very long epic poem entirely with Persian words, deliberately so, as a way to retain Iran's Persian language and history and heritage. And so it was very deliberately done, and he's highly revered in Iran today. Again, when the Islamic Republic came to power, in this effort to deny Iranian identity, much like some of the attempts that we're seeing with Confederate statues in the United States, sought to remove Ferdowsi's statues. And they did so. They removed one of his statues in Tehran, which erupted in protests, which ultimately resulted in them having to put it back up to quell these protests. So you can see that this is a real flashpoint that I'm explaining for you, and it's the key to understanding what is going on in Iran today. I see a lot of nonsense from loser academics in the United States who inevitably end up performing the role of de facto regime apologists. They express next to no support for essentially the cosmic significance of these protests and reduce it to easily reconcilable problems like the price of eggs going up. Now, there are economic factors to be sure, but I just see this happening over and over again in our modern mainstream press because that's a whole nother issue with how garbage a lot of our universities, especially the humanities, have become. So I think the key to understanding 3,000 years of Iranian history. It's the key to understanding the past 1,300 years of Islam in Iran. It's the key to understanding these protests today. It's the key to understanding why slogans like Islam and the Quran, we sacrifice you both to Iran, are being shouted on the streets of Iran in disparate Iranian cities. I mean, people who simply have economic grievances are not going to put their lives at risk and shout what are, in effect, anti-Islamic slogans. They're also tearing down the decrepit posters of Ayatollahs Khomeini and Khamenei, the two leaders of the supreme leaders of the Islamic Republic. They're risking their lives in doing so. This is a much more punishable offense than just holding an assembly over economic protests.
I'll definitely ask you to differentiate the Khomeinis and Khameneis maybe one more time specifically for me, considering I'm not sure if I figured it out completely yet. But maybe you could touch a bit on the climate in Iran pre-1979 and leading up to the revolution of 79.
Sure, no problem. I mean, there's a lot that I'm saying right now that may not resonate with an American audience, so a lot of this might require explanation, and some of it for an informed audience is just going to be kind of obvious. I'll try to walk a fine balance here. Iran since in the 20th century was mostly ruled by a Pahlavi monarchy by Reza Shah and then his son Mohammad Reza Shah. You had essentially a coup take place, reinstalling the younger Shah after this nationalist figure Mohammad Mossadegh took power in 1953. The Brits and the Americans engineered a coup to overthrow him because Mossadegh wanted to nationalize Iran's oil industry, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC. This is really like epitomized in Stephen Kinzer's book, All the Shah's Men. And Mohammad Mossadegh, I mean, all this stuff is crucial if you want to understand where we are today, so I'll go over the long arc of it. But Mohammad Mossadegh wanted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and he was just Iranians lionize him as a nationalist figure, and I certainly have a lot of respect for him. He was a man who was certainly committed to his principles, but ultimately I think that the lionization of Mohammad Mossadegh is overblown, and I see him as a tragic loser. And the reason I see him as a loser is that he lost. He was overthrown in a CIA. This kicked off the CIA foreign engineering coups in foreign lands. This was the first instance of it. The Dulles brothers and this guy Kermit Roosevelt, who was the CIA field officer in charge of this. But so they ran. The CIA had these faux protests. They put out all this propaganda against Mossadegh because they were worried that the Americans were worried that Mossadegh would end up aligning himself with the Soviets. Everything after the Cold War in terms of U.S. foreign policy needs to be understood within a Cold War context, if you understand the decisions that were made by the State Department and the Pentagon and the CIA and the White House. So they were worried that Mohammad Mossadegh would end up aligning himself with the Soviet Union. And this is a very big deal because you have to look at where Iran is on the map. Iran is of huge geopolitical significance. To its south, you have the Persian Gulf, which some 60% of world oil travels through there. I should check that exact figure, but a tremendous amount of the world oil that is shipped in international waterways goes through the Persian Gulf. It has to. They have no other option. At least with current technology, we don't. So the Soviets, their dream was always to expand the USSR all the way to reaching the Persian Gulf. This is why they invaded Afghanistan. A lot of Americans may know that's how we funded the Mujahideen, which ended up being Al-Qaeda. We can talk about that in a minute too. But that's why the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. There's nothing in Afghanistan. They don't want Afghanistan. It's mountains. It's very rough terrain. It's opium, but it doesn't have oil. But Afghanistan was a stepping stone to Iran for the Soviet Union. Naturally, for the Americans, and if the Soviets had reached Iran and reached the Persian Gulf and had the ability to deny the Americans and their allies and their NATO allies had the ability to deny oil resources to them, Cold War over. I mean, it was that significant. This is a big deal. So the Americans were concerned about Mossadegh potentially being a communist. I don't think he was. He was really a kind of neither East nor West nationalist. And the Brits had their own petty financial interests involved because they were making a tremendous amount of money off of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And they were keeping, the profits overwhelmingly to themselves. And this was Iranian oil. Now, ultimately, I think this was one of many tragedies in modern Persian history, modern Iranian history, because they should have cut a deal. Mohammad Mossadegh was an extremist, I would argue. And again, most Iranian nationalists don't think this. They really lionize him. I see him as someone committed to his principles, but failed to capture the pragmatism that's necessary of qualified statesmen. So Mossadegh was overthrown in the CIA engineered coup. They reinstalled Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, and he ran an autocratic state, no doubt about it.
He was a secular ruler, if it's
by and large.
Would you describe him that way?
Ruler, yeah. He and his father had laws not allow, basically banning the hijab, the headscarf covering for Iranian women. So there are some stories of there are pious Iranian Shia and Sunni Muslims in Iran too, who do wish to cover their hair, and they banned those coverings in public. So his father, to some extent, is kind of an Iranian Ataturk to some extent. And a modernizer, had grand visions for improving the country, and he and his son, they ran a monarchy. You could not criticize the monarchy. They did have prisons where people were tortured, but this is the reality. I mean, politics is a dirty game, especially in the Middle East. If you want to stay in power, you have to be willing to do not nice things to stay in power. Sorry to make that plainly true. Because the reality is people are always going to attempt to supplant your power. A group of commanders or any other group are always going to be willing to take you out. So that's the reality of rulers, especially in the developing world as well. Now, so he was a pro-Western, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was a pro-Western monarch. He was funded by the United States. We helped train him. We provided him with tons of military resources. We really started the Iranian nuclear program as well under the Shah. And we provided them with tons of equipment, as did European countries like Germany as well. So we started this because we wanted Iran to be this pro-Western ally that we could rely on. So, the history here is a bit complicated, but eventually in 1978, you have protests start breaking out. Now, those protests that ultimately culminated in the Khomeini returning to Iran from Paris, where he was exiled, they took 18 months. So what we just kicked off in Iran, this is hugely significant. The fact that we haven't overthrown the government yet, I mean, don't worry, there's time. These things don't take place in a week. It took them 18 months in 1978, 79. And they started as economic protests too. And there were long periods during which there were absolutely no protests. It was totally quiet. So people started protesting against the Shah. They had aspirations for something greater for Iran, and there were many forces involved. I'd say the two most potent forces, anti-Shah forces, were the communist Tudeh party, Tudeh, and the Islamic clerical establishment that was centralized around the charismatic figure of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, one of the most important figures of the 20th century, no doubt about it. I mean, you can hardly overestimate the significance of the Islamic Revolution taking place. It's something on the order of the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, it's that important in terms of its effects of global politics. So you had this odd confluence or alignment of leftist Marxists along with religious clerics in Iran, which I see some parallels today with the American modern left, which is just fascinating, with their affinity for Islam, which is, I think, based on pure ressentiment or resentment toward Western culture. We can get into the psychology of that. But in any case, so Khomeini was in exile in Iraq and then in Paris, and the Shah considered executing him, sending assassins or something to execute him while he was exiled in Iraq. And I think he should have. I think one of the problems with the Shah was that he was a pussy, essentially. I mean, I'm being a little unfair to him, but I think he absolutely should have done it. I mean, he would have changed the course of modern history, of political history, if he had just taken Khomeini out. Would have saved tons of lives. Iran would be much more prosperous. But he failed to make that decision. And what's interesting here too is the Islamic Republic, it took a long time to come into power, and it wasn't totally clear whether it was going to be anti-American or not. What ended up happening was that the geopolitics here is really interesting because the Brits and the Americans actually supported Khomeini. Once they realized, Carter was a totally failed president. Carter was one of the worst American presidents certainly in terms of his foreign policy. When the Shah started to have uprisings take place in the country, look, protests happen in countries all the time. We have protests in the we have had massive protests, race riots especially. After Rodney King, we've had massive Black Lives Matter protests. Protest is not unique to Iran, even mass uprisings. But the question is, does the sovereign state have the legitimate use of force to suppress protests? And when these protests broke out in Iran in 1978, the Shah did attempt to put them down at first, and the Carter administration basically cut him loose. Just a few months earlier, Carter is on the record, I think this was on camera, but he was at some fancy glitzy event and referred to Iran under the Shah as an island of stability in a sea of chaos, something like that, because Iran was such a strong ally of the United States. And so he saw Iran as this island of stability. And just a few months later, the Shah was out of power. And Carter had basically cut him loose. Like, he wasn't providing the Shah with riot gear or with rubber bullets or tear gas, the low-level instruments that domestic police use to quell protests. Instead, he wanted the Shah to accede to some of the protesters' demands and come up with some kind of political solutions here. It was totally idealistic. I mean, these were irreconcilable forces. It was a completely idealistic foreign policy that I think was ultimately a mistake. So you had, as I mentioned, the Tudeh Communist Party, and you had Islamists around Ayatollah Khomeini as the primary agitators against the Shah. What ended up happening was that the Brits and the Americans actually supported Khomeini and gave him money. Why do you think they would do that? The reason they did that comes back to the Cold War context, and you have to understand all of U.S. foreign policy in a Cold War context during this period. As I said, the Soviets, they didn't want Afghanistan. They wanted Iran and the Persian Gulf. And the Russians and the Soviets have been a tragedy for Iran. I mean, some 30% of Iranian territory was lost to the Russians in the 19th century. So a lot of the Caucasus that later became part of the USSR and are now, and became Soviet satellite states, those are Iran. I mean, Tajikistan was Iran. They still speak they still speak Persian there too. They speak their dialect of Persian, but so that was so. Obviously, for the foreign policy establishment in the United States and Britain, which are like this, I mean, especially at this time, they're like this against the Soviets. They're talking to each other all the time. They figure we can't have Marxists running Iran because Marxists are going to align with the Soviet sphere of influence. We might as well have a strong Islamist who is going to be diametrically opposed to atheist Soviets, because the Soviet Union was an atheist dictatorship. So, and that was Khomeini's position, basically. So they ended up really supporting Khomeini. And Khomeini's idea was, again, this kind of neither East nor West, kind of a third way, like a part of the non-aligned movement, that they wouldn't be with the Western Bloc nor with the Eastern Bloc. And so the Americans did support him, brought Khomeini eventually to power. And, a lot of that is just a tragedy afterwards. You had the hostage crisis after that, which was actually orchestrated by this cult group called the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, MEK, which are still very active in Iran. And I would caution people who are following these protests on, say, Twitter, for example. There's a lot of MEK, Mujahideen-e-Khalq, propaganda out there. And I would be very careful. I am personally very cautious about what I take seriously and what is their propaganda. And unfortunately, the American media has been complicit in supporting the MEK. A lot of American politicians take money from the MEK. Giuliani does, John Bolton does, Ed Randell does, a lot of guys do, and they speak at their conferences. This is a cult group. This is a group that was on the State Department's terrorist watch list until Hillary Clinton took them off in 2012. Thanks, Hillary. And they've committed acts of terrorism in the past. They've killed Americans, and they see themselves as the right government for Iran. Their leader is this woman, Maryam Rajavi, again, who's a cult leader. And the Wall Street Journal just published a editorial by her, which I think is just very unfortunate. But the MEK, they were the ones that really started the student-led movement that took American hostages for 444 days at the American Embassy, which I visited, the American Embassy in Tehran. And Khomeini was kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, because if he disavows those protesters, then it's like he looks pathetic here. He looks like he's not committed to the principles of the revolution. And yet, if he embraces them, he's inviting a tremendous amount of blowback from the world's superpower. And he ended up embracing them in the end. And that's why, to this day, that was the first instance of the United States imposing sanctions on Iran. They've had sanctions since then. And Iran, the constitution of the Islamic Republic, effectively ended up being an anti-American document, one that identifies oppressors in the world and stands with the people of the oppressed and sees the United States as one of the main oppressors. That's why you hear all the time in Iran at these Friday sermons led by Khamenei and Khomeini previously. You hear Marg bar Amerika, which means death to America, and they refer to the United States as the great Satan.
توجه بفرمایید. البته بله، مرگ بر آمریکا، چون آمریکا اون عامل اصلی این فشارهاست.
And all over Tehran, I'll send you some of these pictures. We'll put them up. I've taken pictures and videos of the the colorful anti-American propaganda that just fills walls and fills buildings all over Tehran, and it's on the American embassy in Tehran as well. There's a wall that's just got all anti-American propaganda. And the embassy today they now refer to in Persian as Lunea Jasusi, which means the den of spies. And I mean, embassies, that's part of the function of embassies, is spying. I mean, make no mistake, they were spying on Iranians from that embassy too. So that's how it's casually known. And so since that's basically Iranian history up until the establishment of the Islamic Republic as an anti-American government. And I think it's basically been a tragedy for Iran, because if you look at, I'll just say this, and then I'll let you go, but I'll let you go with another question. But the reason I want to get to this tragic potential is, if you look at Iran's development indicators in 1977, let's say, Iran was basically on par with South Korea. And South Korea today versus Iran today, I mean, it's apples and oranges. South Korea is way more advanced today. Iran has basically missed out on the past 40 years of development because it sacrificed its economy to politics and to this, fantastical Khomeiniist ideology of exporting the revolution, which inevitably gets Iran into tons of trouble. If they would abandon these principles and consolidate into a constitution based on the principles of Iranian nationalism, you would have a very prosperous, peaceful, stable country in Iran that would, was friendly with its neighbors and would not get into all kinds of trouble. So that's my history so far.
Guys, if you like the video, hit the like button down below, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, leave a comment, follow me at Taylor Beacom on Twitter, follow me at Beacom of Light on Instagram, donate through paypal.me/beacomoflight or patreon.com/beacomoflight. Thanks.